Welcome to Life Learnings. My name is Paul Kachansky. Today we are privileged to have Nathan Brown from the Signs Publishing Company visiting us from Victoria. Nathan, welcome.
Thank you.
It's good to have you back in New South Wales, and today we are highlighting some interesting areas regarding Desmond Doss. I know you've done a lot of study, a lot of writing, a lot of research, and it's a pleasure to have you here.
And certainly my research began many years ago because I grew up with the story of Desmond Doss.
How old were you when you first heard the story?
I couldn't tell you, but I remember it would have been one of the first books that I actually remember reading was the story The Unlikeliest Hero by Booten Herndon, which was one of the first biographies and stories of Desmond Doss that had been written. And so that's probably back in the 80s some stage.
Okay. Do you remember how you felt when you read that story?
Well, he's one of those guys that is when you read the story, it's a story of a hero, someone that's done something quite remarkable, stood up for his faith and been able to do good things for others in a very difficult circumstance, and then been honoured for that in a remarkable kind of way. So certainly something that made a really strong impression on me as a young person.
Yes. And from that first time to when you reconnected with his story as an adult, did you give it much thought?
It's just one of those stories that in my church life is just part of the environment, really. Okay. It's everybody knows who he is. It's one of those stories that's been retold at different points along the way. But probably not a story that I'd spent a lot of time thinking on. And when the documentary The Conscientious Objector came out, 2004, that reconnected the story and told it in a new way, of course, because there you had the man himself and, as an old man, remembering his story and, revisiting some of the places that the story had taken place. And, so that was my reintroduction to it. And since that time, and, have come across it a number of times since.
And you've done a lot of writing about his story in different contexts. You had the privilege of meeting Terry Benedict.
Terry Benedict is the filmmaker who made The Conscientious Objector. He first met Desmond Doss. He had a similar experience of growing up with the story, and then he met Desmond Doss in 1999 and realised that the guy he met was the same guy. He was a real hero, not just a made-up one.
Yes.
And genuine in who he was and what he believed and how he lived. And Terry, as a filmmaker with some experience at that point, said, this is a story that needs to be told more widely. And, I've got a camera and I've got skills to do it, so let's find a way to do that. And so he spent a bit of time getting to know Desmond for a start. Desmond had resisted movies being made of his life.
Why did you do that?
Well, it has been suggested that one of the things was that he, as a conservative Christian, didn't believe in movies. So there was kind of that thing that he'd been brought up with and come with honestly. But also I think there was a sort of the fear that his story would not be told fairly or accurately, could be misrepresented in some way or diminish some of the more miraculous parts of it or whatever.
Yeah, because I guess writing the story down and portraying it on film, sometimes there's a disparity there.
As Terry got to know him, Terry, as he tells the story, they were standing outside a supermarket in Tennessee, and basically Terry said, well, if you let me make your story into a film, I will answer to God first, you second, and everybody else can get in line. And so basically that I promise to look after your story and treat it as it deserves. And that became, firstly, a really strong friendship between Terry and Desmond. And then became the documentary in 2004. That included Terry spending time with Desmond and a number of his men, soldiers that he'd actually rescued or had been part of his company in that time, all of whom were in their 80s and 90s at that point, and all of whom sadly have died now. But Terry so took a group of them, about half a dozen of the guys, back to Okinawa, to where the actual, to Hacksaw Ridge where the battle took place. And, the logistics of taking a bunch of old, quite old guys, some of them not super well,
Yes.
To the other side of the world and looking after them was quite a feat.
Wow.
But, got the story. And so his longer-term plan with it had always been that he wanted a feature film made from it. And making the documentary, while it was valuable in itself, was also a stepping stone in that journey.
Yes.
And also important for getting the guys on film while they were still with us and able to tell their stories. And so once he'd finished the documentary, he received awards for it and had some really good responses to it. At the time it was actually filmed with some cutting edge technology that film nerds understand and I don't really.
Okay.
But it was made to the highest possible specifications at the time.
Yes.
And so then once that was done and he'd done the work with that, he headed to Hollywood to see if he could find people that were prepared to work with him and to put together a team to do that. So that's 2004, and it was a 10-year process from then until the actual making of the film was green-lighted and funded and all of those kind of things. So, so getting to 2016, we have Hacksaw Ridge, and it's been a 17-year journey for Terry with Desmond and his story, and a remarkable thing. And I admire Terry very much for what he's done with that. Yeah.
And you've been part of that journey in writing and reviewing a number of books that have been written on the subject.
We've done a little bit associated with it. We got Terry out here in Australia in 2013. He came to the Manifest Creative Arts Festival that I was a co-convener of.
And that was in Avondale College?
Yes. Okay. And so Terry came out here. We knew about his work and he came and taught some classes on how to make films and some of these kind of things. Nice. But the highlight of the weekend for me was we did a screening of The Conscientious Objector with Terry. He introduced the film, then we showed it, and then we did a Q&A with him afterwards. And one of the interesting things that really caught my attention was that how Terry responded to watching the film with us. He told us afterwards that he hadn't watched it for about 6 years by that stage, and that all the key people in the film had died in that intervening time. And he said, he was actually quite emotional about it, and just, he was moved by reconnecting with those guys and their stories again. Of course, when you spend a lot of time doing a creative project like that, you can get to the point where you're almost kind of sick of the sight of it.
Yes.
When it
so
comes
engrossed
to
in the story,
filming and editing, then you spend a year or two talking about it and selling it and all those kind of things. And so, quite naturally, he kind of put it on the shelf and hadn't spent time with it for a while. But this was his first time back at it, and it was a really good experience. And then in the question and answer time, he really shared, some of his heart and passion that he had for the story, and the close friendship that he developed with Desmond, and came to see him as kind of his adopted grandfather.
Wow!
And that was very cool.
Nathan, for many of our listeners, they may not have connected with the story of Desmond Doss prior to the Hacksaw Ridge making a big splash, and The Conscientious Objector. It's a bit of a mouthful. But how would you summarise the story without giving too much of the detail away? Who was Desmond Doss? Why is his story so important? Why did you spend some time, writing about it? And you've written at least 5-6 articles, maybe more, about his story.
Desmond Doss grew up in the American South in Tennessee, in very poor and difficult circumstances. But part of his experience as a young person was faith, and it talks in the documentary. They show the picture of the 10 Commandments that they had on the wall in their home, and that this was values that were ingrained in him very much. And as when World War II rolled around, and he, along with many other people, of course, wanted to serve his country, but he had a strong conviction that he should not carry a gun, and that he wasn't to kill anybody in that role.
That's a pretty bold statement, though.
Well,
to go to war without a gun.
Indeed. And I think that the Hacksaw Ridge movie has been described as very violent. Mm-hmm. It's rated MA in Australia for its depiction of war, and that, and of course as a medic, which he ultimately became, he
saw that.
You see the worst of it. You're in the middle of it. Yeah. Wow. And so, while perhaps it's good that war is actually portrayed for the ugliness and the horror that it is, and it also shows the craziness, to use that kind of language, of walking into that kind of situation without any means to defend yourself.
He had beliefs that drove him to this.
Yeah. And, so he... So he was labelled as a conscientious objector, as the title of the DVD suggests, by the army, but partly because the army didn't know what else to do with him. He described himself as a conscientious cooperator. Okay. That he wasn't objecting, he was trying to help, he was trying to serve his nation, but he simply had limits on how far he'd go with that based on his beliefs and his values. He read the Sixth Commandment, thou shalt not kill, and took it seriously. And so he was, when he enlisted in the army, he was trained as a medic, and went through a very difficult time during military training, both because of his refusal to even learn how to fire a gun. He would just not touch one. But also the other part of his commandment keeping that he took seriously was keeping the Sabbath of the fourth commandment. And so he would try not to have to do his normal duties on the seventh day of the week, and would often, as much as possible, apply for leave passes so that he could attend church and these kind of things. And for this, his men described him as a shirker. And his
he had a hard time.
His officers weren't particularly interested in helping their slacker get days off when everybody else was training and working and all those kind of things. So he was persecuted. He had a really difficult time, but stayed true to what he believed and did the best he could in each of the circumstances that he found himself. When his company was shipped out, they ended up in Okinawa in the Battle of Hacksaw Ridge. And that became and is still regarded as one of the bloodiest and the highest casualty tolls of the entire Second World War. There were about 100,000 Japanese soldiers killed there over a week or so, and 50,000 American soldiers, plus a lot of local people, and a horrendous thing to be in the middle of. And so on May the 5th, 1945, he was the day that he became a hero.
What happened that day?
It was a Sabbath, and but his company had been asked to make an assault on this Hacksaw Ridge, which was a very steep escarpment with the Japanese entrenched on the top. And of course the risk was that the American soldiers had to get to the top, and then they were confronted by everything that the Japanese were throwing at them. And a very difficult and risky mission. Doss was medic on duty. He wanted to study his Bible before he went, and so the attack on the ridge was actually delayed for a period of time so that he could do what he needed to do, but then he was willing to go and help. Wow. As well as believing in the Sabbath, he also believed what Jesus taught, that it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And he
served his fellow man on that day.
Yeah. And so while reports are a little bit sketchy of some of these kind of things, the kind of agreed figure of the number of men whose lives he saved that day was 75. And each of those men he had to rescue. He would treat as quickly and as whatever as possible. And then he would let them down, lower them on ropes from the cliff edge, where they would then be taken to safety and to further medical treatment. Wow. So it was about 12 hours that he was up here there, at times taking significant risks as far as being exposed to enemy fire and those kind of things, but somehow kept safe in the middle of it all. Wow. And and at the end of the day he was his whole situation had changed, and he was a hero. He was later injured in the war, and that was the end of the war for him. And when he returned home, he was presented with the Congressional Medal of Honor, the first conscientious objector to receive that honor, which is the highest award for bravery in the US military. And a remarkable aspect of that is that it's the kind of award medal that you only get with the testimony of everybody that's been involved with it. So eyewitnesses who are actually at the battle need to fill out the appropriate forms, and then everybody up the chain of command has to sign off on it.
So it's not just a one person's nomination; it's a group effort.
So all these people that had been giving him a hard time, these men that had been persecuting him, these officers who were questioning, his loyalty, his character, his everything,
had to sign off
on this guy has done something remarkable and needs to be recognised as such. So he went on. He lived, despite his fame and notoriety, he returned to a relatively simple rural life in Tennessee and lived out his days there. Had his challenges throughout life, and lived just as a humble, simple man for the rest of his life, and eventually died in 2006.
What a remarkable life story. Thank you, Nathan, for...
That's the quick overview.
For giving us the overview. Our guest today is Nathan Brown. He works with and for the Science Publishing Company in Warburton, Victoria as a book editor. And we are privileged to have him share about the Desmond Doss story and Nathan's involvement. Nathan, you've written a number of articles, one of which I read briefly, was dealing with doing good and the link with the Good Samaritan. Would you say that Desmond Doss was a Good Samaritan in a way?
Yeah, in a way. He is, he's often held up as someone who took the commandments seriously, and I've already mentioned, remember the Sabbath day and thou shalt not kill and some of these kind of things. But Jesus, when he was talking about the commandments, he affirmed them. Yes. And he was very... but he had a different kind of answer when he was asked what the most important commandment was. And it was kind of a bit of one of these tricky conversations that Jesus sometimes found himself in the middle of. But his answer, and drawn from Scripture as well, was, the greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind and your soul. And the second is like unto it. So intertwined with it is love your neighbour as yourself.
So those two go together?
They're almost two sides of the same coin.
Okay.
And in that context, they were the two guiding overall primary commandments that Doss lived by and demonstrated in his actions. His first loyalty was to God and to doing what he believed God instructed for living life well and obediently. But in that same thing, loving your neighbour as yourself. And in the Gospel of Luke, when those two commandments are talked about, the greatest commandment and then 1 and 2, it then leads into the story of the Good Samaritan. And the Good Samaritan is the story of an unlikely hero. Someone who didn't fit the mould, someone you wouldn't expect to be the guy who comes in to save the day. And certainly Doss fits that kind of model. But I also think that there's a little bit more to it in that he didn't just happen to get into this, to see someone on the side of the road. He actually put himself in a place of danger, of risk, of discomfort, he went through a lot to get to the point where he could help these people. Yes. And so in a way he's almost an even better Samaritan in that sense, that he went out of his way to help people. And he certainly did that in a powerful way in probably what would be some of the worst experiences or worst context that we could imagine.
Pain. And Doss, I read something that Doss was injured, and when he was carried on, is it a litter? Is that what you call it, like a lifter?
With the people, like a stretcher.
Like a stretcher? Yep. Where Doss actually rolled off that to give way to someone else injured. I mean, that's not just something you just do without tremendous sacrifice and tremendous gifting of almost life and saving someone's life to do that.
Yeah. Well, loving your neighbour as yourself, it's valuing somebody else's life as much as you value yours.
Yes.
And we have this inherent instinct to do everything we can to preserve our own lives and to keep ourselves safe.
Yes.
And that's really what that commandment is, that we should have that same instinct towards others, and particularly those who are in need or suffering or in pain or whatever it might be.
And to value someone else's life, as you said, to value that they have family, that they have goals and aspirations, and to treat others as God treats them, as Jesus treats them, and that's with immense love. Yeah,
it's an incredible picture of that. Yeah,
it is.
So Desmond Doss, the even better Samaritan.
That's maybe you should write another article about that. So you also mentioned, Nathan, that Desmond was very humble. He didn't want his story told.
Yeah. And when I talked, one of the things when I interviewed Terry those few years ago now, when we'd had that film screening and I was sort of hosting the question and answer section, one of the things that stuck with me, and then when I interviewed him again recently in conjunction with Hacksaw Ridge and his involvement with that, there was this statement that stuck with me where he said that of all the people he's met in his life, Desmond Doss was the person most like Jesus that he'd ever met.
Wow.
Which is a powerful statement, particularly for someone who takes Jesus seriously.
Yes.
That's not something you'd throw around lightly. And so when I had an opportunity to interview Terry again recently, he talked about, I asked him about this and said, what do you actually mean by that? And just went a bit deeper with it. And he made the comment that he's the kind of guy that lives by principle, beautifully humble, and at the same time, the kind of person that when you spend time with, you feel like you're a better person after it. And he said sometimes that was obvious and sometimes it was almost imperceptible in how his influence when you spent time with him would rub off on him. But one of the stories Terry told me was that his children, who were 4 and 6 at the time when Desmond died 10 years ago, still remember him as someone who cared about them and who had a really significant impact on their life.
In such a young age?
At such a young age, wow. 10 years later, still remembering that impact, and that, there's something powerful in that.
Why do you think that was portrayed in such a way?
Yeah, well, I think humility is a very key part of it. Humility is probably one of the most undervalued values, but it's certainly a biblical value. And Jesus said, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
Yeah, that's in Matthew chapter 5, the Beatitudes.
Yeah, one of the Beatitudes.
Blessed.
Yeah, and we kind of look at that and say, well, how does that even make sense? The Beatitude, blessed or happy is the person who's meek. It doesn't fit with everything we're told about how life should be lived. Throughout history, people don't win. Meek people don't win. They tend to be. We assume that they're the kind of people who are walked over and maybe don't even stand up for anything much. They're the people who will always be last in line and all of these kind of things. But Jesus taught that somehow that is the thing that actually wins in the end.
Yes,
that matters. And so this idea of humility, I think, for one, it comes with a recognition, in Desmond Doss's case, a recognition of his relationship in relationship to God. God is God, I'm not.
Yes.
I rely on him, I trust him for everything I do.
Humbled by that relationship.
Yeah. And so even in the situation and after what Desmond had gone through with the men in training, the incredible temptation it would be to stop and go, well, why would I help these guys? They've been giving me a really rough time for the last months, years, whatever it was. And then imagine those guys who are the ones getting picked up by this guy who's been the butt of all their jokes. They've mocked and they've ridiculed and they've harassed in all these different ways. And this is the guy who's bending over them, taking a risk to help them and to rescue them. And that's a transformative thing like that. And watching the Conscientious Objector documentary, those men 50 years later still remember that, and their affection, their love for Doss after all that time and compared to what they were before is a remarkable testimony to the transforming power of humility and service in that kind of way.
Yeah. And would it be right to say, Nathan, that Desmond did what he did not to gain the Congressional Medal of Honor?
No.
He didn't even think of that.
It's probably the last thing in his mind when you're on top of a ridge getting fired at.
Desmond didn't want this film to be made to uplift himself, but he was living for some cause and someone greater.
Yeah, and
is that the true strength of a person's life, to live for a cause greater than yourself?
Well, I can't really argue with that as an idea. It's beyond. I mean, all of us, when we have those quiet moments in ourselves and we reflect on, well, I'm actually a pretty ordinary type person, and we know better than anybody else, even if we pretend or try and deny it or whatever, where we come up short and what our failings are, and things that we wish were better about us and things like that. There's two responses to that. One of them is to recognise our place in the universe, and particularly our place in relationship to God. The other is to sort of pump ourselves up and try and bluster on regardless. And I know which has the most sustainability to it, and the one that will last forever.
Nathan, we've been speaking about the role that Desmond Doss played in war, and if people are interested in exploring that story further, you at Science Publishing Company have an offer that we would like to extend to our listeners and their families. What's that?
We're working with a website that's being developed, and this is what I've been doing some of the writing on recently that you've referenced, called faithofdoss.com.
Okay.
So there'll be a number of things that people can explore, different aspects of what Desmond Doss believed in, what motivated him to do what he did, aspects of the story. I think some of the interview that I did with Terry Benedict will be there as well. So some insights into even a little bit behind the scenes of the movie and some of those kind of things. Okay. But through that website, there's an opportunity to connect with a number of other opportunities to further explore the story of Desmond Doss or his faith. There's a book that is being made available that will be offered free from that website called The Hero of Hacksaw Ridge, which has a little bit of the story and then a little bit of the faith aspect of it, which looks like a good thing. And there'll be some other opportunities as well. And of course, there's the opportunity to connect with Terry Benedict's documentary, The Conscientious Objector, which is available from Adventist book centres and places like that.
Okay.
So if you've got an interest in going deeper with the story, then there's that kind of opportunity as well.
So people can purchase a DVD around Australia and New Zealand from Adventist book centres and watch the story as Terry portrays that. That is...
which is Desmond Doss telling it in his own words, and that's a remarkable thing. He's an old man. He's very deaf at the time of filming. He almost needs subtitles on, because he had a cochlear implant late in life, and that affects your ability to speak clearly and some of those kind of things sometimes. But it's a remarkable thing to look at this older man, reflect on his story as a younger man, and also hear testimonies from some of the guys that were on the ridge with him that day.
So the website again is called faithofdoss.com. So to explore further about what Nathan's been sharing, we encourage you to visit that website, faithofdoss.com. And also there's a number of books available at the Adventist book centres that explore this story further. Yeah,
there's been a few attempts at writing his story. One of the interesting ones is simply called The Conscientious Objector, the book, as distinguished from the DVD, which was written by his wife.
So that's an interesting perspective.
Which is a different perspective on him as a man. And he lost his first wife earlier in life, through ill health.
Mm-hmm.
And then he remarried, and this is the story written by his second wife, reflecting back to his experiences in World War II, but also kind of introducing him a little bit more as he was an older man, and the faith that was still a significant part of his life at that point.
Thank you, Nathan. Nathan, as you mentioned before, the Sabbath was a really important part of Doss's life. He observed the seventh-day Sabbath as he observed the commandment that he read, "You shall not kill." So in the Bible, Exodus chapter 20 has a simple statement and a number of simple statements, 10 of them in fact, called the Ten Commandments.
Simple to read, not so simple to live by.
But he did that in the most difficult and hostile environment among soldiers, among officers, among peers, among the war environment. Is the Sabbath such an important day commandment that Doss would in fact risk his reputation, his life for? Is it still relevant? I mean, how do you understand the Sabbath context in that environment and then translate that to our day today?
Yeah, it's fascinating, even in the Doss story, about putting the Sabbath next to "thou shalt not kill," because you can see the logic of not killing, because killing hurts people.
Yes.
A lot of people agree that that's not the best thing to do. At least not in general circumstances. So, there'd be arguments at times about just war and justified things. But, on a simple reading, it's pretty straightforward.
Yes.
And some of the other commandments, "thou shalt not steal," things that are generally accepted in society as kind of good to some kind of well-ordered living. But it's interesting in that list of 10, and they're all treated equally. In fact, if you go down the list of, it begins with, a focus on God, to put God first, and not to worship other things, and not to take God's name in vain. And then the fourth of those is, to keep the Sabbath, and to put those things next to not killing, not stealing, not cheating on your partner, those kind of things, is a fascinating conjunction of these two ideas, that one set of these things is important as the other. And I think it comes back to what I mentioned earlier. Really they are summarised by love God with all you are, and then love your neighbour as yourself. But they aren't disconnected.
No.
They're put together as all a part of living well. And, one of the ways of thinking about what's wrong in the world is simply that they're about broken relationships. Broken relationships with God, broken relationships with ourselves, broken relationships with others, and with our larger environment. And if we look at that, and all those things are spelled out in the original story in Genesis 3, if we look at those and then come back to this list of rules for living well as God set them out to his people back in Exodus, it was, let's look after all of those relationships. And Sabbath is, in the context of mending relationships and bringing people to living well, is as important as not killing. It may not have the direct impact on somebody else straight away, but when that relationship with God is strong in the centre of somebody's life, as Desmond demonstrated in the way he lived and acted, then it has beneficial benefits to those other relationships as well. And, so they're part of a package of living well.
And it's more than just not working. It's about relationships, not only yourself with God, but also those in your household, those in your even your animals. Care. That's right.
Which is a remarkable thing.
It is.
And, so it's even Sabbath keeping as such, as it's listed and described in that commandment, is not about ourselves. It's something that benefits all the people around us. which is a fascinating thing. And
it's a blessing further than just the individual.
That's right. It should benefit the whole of a society. And scholars have pointed out that in ancient law systems, if you go even into other ancient cultures, there's nothing like this that has benefits for everybody. And this is something quite unique in the in the Ten Commandments, in the Sabbath.
Which is interesting because God wrote the Ten Commandments with his own finger in stone. So that's pretty permanent. And when God, the author of life, the author of everything good, writes these ways down for Moses to record in the Bible, that's quite remarkable.
It's also interesting what Jesus did with the commandments when he was on earth, and in his teaching, commandments such as, do not kill, he actually took it deeper. He said, you've heard it said that, thou shalt not kill, but I also say that if you get angry with someone, then you're also breaking this commandment because it's damaging that relationship. And similarly, it has been said, don't commit adultery. But if you look at someone lustfully, then you've already done that in your heart. The relationship is damaged by that. And so the same kind of thing, that Jesus emphasised the relationship aspect of the commandments, both with God and ourselves, but also with others and how that impacts on others. And he did the same thing with the Sabbath commandment because but interestingly, he modified it, not in making the Sabbath less important, but actually what people were doing with the Sabbath. And, Jesus went out of his way to heal on the Sabbath. There's 6 or 7 miracles that Jesus is recorded as doing on Sabbath that were chronic conditions that didn't need to be done that day. But Jesus seemed to want to make a point that Sabbath was a day for healing.
Liberation.
And setting people free and restoring relationships. And so, as Jesus said, it is lawful to do good on Sabbath. So that was his modification or addition to the Sabbath commandment was don't get so focused on yourself. Remember, this is about other people. This is about bringing benefits to those around us. And so, in the situation that Doss found himself in May 1945 in the middle of the bloodiest battle of the Second World War, it happened to be Sabbath, but there were people that needed help, and he recognised that higher calling to be true to God was to use this day to serve and to heal and to do what he could to help people who were in a terrible situation.
Yeah. Nathan, how can we learn from this story and really apply it to our lives? There are many people that will be reading about this story and learning about this man, Desmond Doss. What do you think is the lesson that we can take from his life and apply it to our day today?
It was something that I've been thinking on since I recently interviewed Terry again in connection with this, and I sort of said, I asked him that question. For someone who knew him and spent a lot of time with him and certainly a lot of time with his story, I just said to him, what do we take away from this? What do you see as the most important thing from it? And his comment surprised me a little because we often talk about, standing up for what you believe and standing firm in, following these things and in difficult situations. And he said, to me, the overriding thing of Desmond's life was to trust God.
Okay.
And to trust him to get you through whatever the worst of the circumstances you might be able to imagine or, things coming your way. And just to have that sort of firm, humble, underlying trust that somehow God will see you through the day.
So that is, in Terry's mind and in your mind, far more important than the strength of I'll be strong, I'll resist, I'll object to carrying a gun, that kind of quote-unquote bravery.
Yeah.
But in fact...
But those things come in the context of that underlying relationship with God and that trust. Trust is such a superb word.
Yes.
Because it's the kind of, it's more than faith, it's more than belief. It's this thing of reliance, of sitting back and saying, well, I'm standing up for what I believe, but it's not about me. It's this bigger thing that I'm trusting in the bigger power involved with this, in God, in a personal relationship with God, and that God, whether I survive this battle or not, I still trust him. And I'll do what I can in the situation to do what I believe is right, whether that's standing up or whether that's serving, or both, whatever those things may be. To have that deeper trust is the foundation for it all. Because as you say, if we just try and rely on ourselves and what we feel like often are dependent on our circumstances.
Yes.
When things are going well, it's kind of easy to have faith or to say we have faith. But when things are tough, personally or in whatever way it might be, we need to have that kind of underlying trust that God is good, that God has got our back. And that makes it okay even if it isn't okay.
Even if it is difficult to stand up for the right. So Nathan, there's a quote that I'm sure you've read before, and it's in the book called Education, page 57. And I think it's quite appropriate to what we've been discussing today. The greatest want of the world is the want of men. Men who will not be bought or sold. Men who in their inmost souls are true and honest. Men who do not fear to call sin by its right name. Men whose conscience is as true to duty as the needle to the pole. Men who will stand for the right, though the heavens fall. And I think Doss's life and Doss's faith particularly
seemed to be that kind of guy.
Was that kind of guy. And that's a challenge for us all, isn't it? And the next part of the quote goes on, but such a character is not the result of accident. It is not due to special favours or endowments of providence. A noble character is the result of self-discipline, of the subjection of the lower to the higher nature, the surrender of self for the service of love to God and man.
Nice work.
Nice work. And that kind of experience was displayed in this man's life. And we are privileged to have his story preserved, and I was interested to find out that there's a Desmond Doss Council that look after his story, his legacy, to make sure that the story is not forgotten and not exploded into some fanciful story, as you mentioned.
Well, this is the thing, and you could preach 100 sermons on all these, the various of the different ideas that we've talked about today, just all these different aspects of it that, and we can talk about them in theory, and we can quote the Bible verses and have these great quotes, and all of those are very valuable things, but to see the story of them lived out in someone's life in a terrible situation, but also in a heroic situation, is such a powerful thing. It shows that this isn't just theory. It isn't just nice ideas. It's something that is transformative. It's something that can be real. It's something that can make a real difference in the world. And so, these kind of stories are such powerful, powerful things to capture our imagination. And when you read a story like this, when you engage in a story like it, you are drawn into it. How would I respond in those situations? What would it mean for me to make decisions like that in my life, whatever my circumstances are? It's like the lab test where you actually move something just out from a theory into how does this actually work? How does it make sense? And what does a life lived true to these principles look like and with trust in God look like?
Nathan, for many people, they haven't faced war, and many of our generation haven't gone to war, and maybe that's a good thing.
It's not something I'm keen to do.
But before we started this interview, I think I asked you, what would you have done And I know that's a difficult question to answer because sometimes we don't know how we'll respond given a certain situation.
Well, I think as you know, in my church, the Adventist church, we have a really strong tradition of standing up for what we believe against the cry of rushing off to war. You know, before our church existed as a denomination, we were involved in North America in the US Civil War, and our church was considered a peace church, was described as a peace church, and you know, our people, while helping with the issues, you know, involved in the Underground Railroad and helping slaves escape from slavery in the South, which of course was one of the core reasons behind the US Civil War, was generally not involved in sending our young men to fight in the war. And certainly that kind of conscientious objection, that kind of peacemaking is a part of the heritage that we have as a church. And yeah, sometimes that can get a little bit watered down, and it has been in some places and times. Not that everybody, you know, these things are things of conscience, and so people need to wrestle with them personally as well as us having, you know, broader, you know, from a church perspective, some broader understandings on these issues. But I do think that, you know, war is a really terrible thing. At best, and that's probably not even the right word, but at best it's something of last resort and should only be that. And, you know, what participation or support, you know, faithful people should have on that is complicated, but, you know, there's some pretty strong principles that, you know, people like Desmond Doss actually demonstrated. It's fascinating. Terry was mentioning when he was doing the documentary with him, he was looking forward to being able to sit down with him and have that kind of discussion. You know, philosophical, you know, for war, anti-war, you know, all of these kind of things. And he was surprised, but perhaps also satisfied that Doss's answer to that was very short. And so when he asked him the question, it was a 60-second response, and that was the end of the discussion, where he simply said, "I believe God convicted me not to carry a gun. I'm not judging what other people did in that situation, but that I had to be true to what God convicted me to do."
Interesting.
And that was the discussion from his perspective. Now, I think there is more to it than that, and I think there are worthwhile discussions. You know, what would I do in that situation? I would hope that I would stand up against war, you know, as much as possible, and you know, to seek to, you know, the first call on God's people, I believe, in the Bible is to be peacemakers. You know, in these kind of situations, that blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And, you know, that kind of creative, faithful peacemaking, I think, is kind of, for me, that's difficult to reconcile with marching off to war. And I think that in a, you know, even outside the context of war, I think in a society that has an increasing attitude of violence, whether that's in, you know, in all sorts of different ways, and not even in ways more than just, you know, people beating up one another, but in, you know, our whole attitude to how we live life, even things like road rage and some of these kind of things that, you know, become a part of what's on the news and what's in society around us. We need to be people of peace, people who, because of our trust in God, can stand up in these situations and say, you know, there are other ways to resolve disputes between people and between groups and between communities and nations. And
to step back and say, is God in control? He ultimately is.
Yeah, and that's a valuable perspective that we have as people of faith, which means that we should live differently and that we approach some of these questions differently.
Nathan, I don't know how much time we want to spend on this and how much time we have to explore this, but the Bible does mention a number of wars, particularly in the Old Testament, where, you know, David went off to war at the instruction of God. And a lot of people have questions about that. Would you briefly comment, please, about you know, someone that has read parts of the Old Testament, and I know this is a parenthesis, to read the whole Bible in context. To read one story and say this is what God is like is unfair, just as much as taking a snapshot of you, Nathan, and saying this is what Nathan's like.
Well, the one story we can read and say this is what God is like is the story of Jesus. And in my reading of the Bible, we start with Jesus. And then we read the rest of the Bible in the light of Jesus. And I think there's a lot of things that happen in the Old Testament that aren't the ideal of how life should be. There's a lot of things that happen in the New Testament that aren't either. Instead, they're simply stories of life. And there's all sorts of discussion to be had often when nations march off to war and they claim it in the name of God. God may not be there. It's a useful thing to use to try and rally the troops, but it may not be sometimes the most honest use of the name of God. It could even be taking the name of God in vain to get back to those commandments we were talking about before. I do think that God deals with people differently at different stages of history, and I think when we look at some of the stories in the Old Testament, and these are often used as objections to Christianity, is that we need to understand them in the times in which they live, and that sometimes God's response to some of the situations is not a pattern that should be followed forever. It's a response in a specific situation, and it also references, it's meeting the people where they were at, in a very violent society where you had all these little clans that fought against each other, and that was life. So there are some things that I struggle to explain in some of that. There are some things that are complicated. There are some things that are just plain ugly and are not patterns for anything that we should be following. But it comes back to Jesus, and even in the context of war, I ask the question and say, well, where would Jesus be marching off to war? And who would Jesus bomb?
Jesus didn't rally his disciples to fight with clubs and spears and the
one experience where his disciples did take up a sword was Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he took the guy's ear off. And Jesus turned and healed him.
Yes.
And I sometimes wonder if Jesus today doesn't come along behind some of the well-meaning, well-intentioned things that some of the things we do that hurt other people. And he's the healing presence there in spite of his people.
Yes.
And so if Jesus would be the medic if, at best, if he was involved at all.
Yes.
He would be the Desmond Doss. Doing that kind of thing. I don't imagine how Jesus would be the person carrying the gun or throwing the grenade. And I know that the Jesus I know would be someone who would be seeking to disarm the whole situation as much as possible. And Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world, it's something different. It's of a different nature. And so it's not about fighting wars, and it's not about, that kind of power. And, ultimately it's actually the humble and the meek and the little things that make up the kingdom of God, and it grows from there.
And the statement that God chooses to describe himself, God is love. He repeats that a number of times in the Bible, and we need to remember that. Now, Nathan, just to finish off, we have been speaking about many different issues, and I guess it comes down to the controversy between good and evil. And there's a book by that title that I'm sure you're very familiar with, Science Publishing Company, The Great Controversy. And one day we can ultimately say that God will make all things right. He's promised that in the Bible. He's promised to have no more war, no more pain, no more suffering, no more tears. And we want to leave that hope and that promise of the Bible with our listeners.
And that's a valuable, important, big picture to keep in mind of all of this. The other part that I think is important, and we mentioned the Good Samaritan earlier, in The Desire of Ages, another book by Ellen White, when she is commenting on the story of the Good Samaritan, she actually makes the comment that our neighbour is anyone who is in need of help. Our neighbour is anyone who is wounded by the adversary. So that's using that kind of great controversy language to talk about our role as agents of healing, of help, of service, agents of reversal. And if we're talking great controversy type language, at the end of Romans chapter 12, Paul has this great line about overcoming evil by doing good.
Yes.
And to me, you can't imagine a worse evil than a battlefield. And you can't imagine a greater good than someone in the midst of it with self-sacrifice and at their own risk and their own, so putting their life on the line to serve others and to heal and to help and to do whatever he can, in that situation, to be an agent of healing, an agent of reversal, an agent of the kingdom of God in that way.
Our guest today has been Nathan Brown, book editor at the Science Publishing Company in Warburton, Victoria. Nathan, thank you for insightful comments.
Not a problem.
Thank you for taking your time to explore these issues of the faith of Doss and your research and your writing and your interviewing with key people involved in that story. Once again, the website that Nathan Brown mentioned is faithofdoss.com.
Yep.
You can purchase a DVD called The Conscientious Objector from the Adventist book centres around Australia and New Zealand to get the full story.
Indeed, and it's a great documentary. It really is it's a moving story and it's a powerful story, and to actually have some small connection to someone who is a genuine hero is a great thing.
Nathan Brown, thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Thanks.
If you have questions or comments about any of the programs you've heard, you can call 3ABN Australia Radio within Australia on 02 4973 3456, or from outside of Australia on country code 612 4973 3456. Our email address is radio@3abnaustralia.org.au. That is radio@3 Australia, all one word, .org.au. Our postal address is 3ABN Australia Inc., PO Box 752, Morisset, New South Wales 2264, Australia. Thank you for your prayers and financial support.
Do you enjoy listening to 3ABN Radio Network? Would you like others to enjoy our network too? With your help, we'd like to reach more communities with this life-changing network. Would you consider supporting us through your prayers and financial support? 3ABN Radio Network is 100% listener supported. Our postal address is 3ABN Australia Inc., PO Box 752, Morisset, New South Wales 2264, Australia. Call us on 02 4973 3456. Our email address is mail@3abnaustralia.org.au. You can visit our website or search for our Facebook pages, 3ABN Australia Radio and 3ABN Australia. We'd welcome your contact today. To purchase this and other CDs, visit our online store at 3abnaustralia.org.au. This is a sample from Henry Higgins playing I Will Follow Thee from his CD Near to the Heart. You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.